So wrap that chat. Okay. Hi, and welcome to Cancelcast. My name's Kat Boyd. I'm joined with my lovely co-host David Jameson.
How's it going?
Fine. We also have another, well, not another guest, just a guest. And we have Robert Sommyne, who is a journalist with Scotia. I'm really rubbish at introducing people, so you're probably better having a go yourself.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily call myself a journalist. I'd probably say sort of arch propagandist for Putin's regime. I've also accepted payment from the Ayatollahs as well. They tend to pay better than Russia because obviously, you got connection with oil there as well. So,
of course.
But yeah, sort of been writing for about probably about 8 years, and then I've been in Scotland for about 7 years. So it's I've got to a position where I'm kind of more in the think tank business than in the writing article business now. Unlike David, who's actually a bona fide writer.
I wouldn't say that, man. It's just more propaganda, to be honest. And I agree with your approach of riding on more than one evil regime at once, because you never know when one of those is going to get flattened. You know what I mean? By America, or some sort of James Bond type entity. You never know when the next evil sort of volcano-dwelling Bond villain is going to get overthrown. So you can't just bet on one horse.
That's a very beautiful segue into the topics for today's pod. Anti-Americanism, and we will be discussing Scotland's very own James Bond. That's Alan Smith, by the way. just in case you were confused there. He is very James Bond. Like, he's very kind of like, do you know what I mean?
He's kind of suave, yeah.
Yeah, suave and transatlantic. He's got that vibe. Robert, I like your sexy Soviet gym teachers. I won't say what I said before about them.
No. This is kind of my rebellion against modernity. The idea that keeping fit is fascist, when in fact keeping fit is true to the natural state of the working class. Like I was really interested in that. It's kind of partly a joke, but then people took it seriously on Twitter. Different sections of the left were arguing about whether having muscular thighs or having really strong shoulders and biceps was fascist or left-wing or both. Because like if you have like really strong biceps and shoulders, and it shows that you're connected to the industrial working class, but then if you have really strong thighs, then that means that you want to goose step over everyone. So that's the debate that's going along in the American left sphere.
This sounds like a typically American Twitter left sort of high quality conversation.
Well, back up. What side are you on?
Thighs or like upper body strength? I've got neither. So
No. Babes, I know you've got neither, right? But that's not what I meant. I mean, like.
No, right. That's just that. I'm rebelling against exercise. Period. So I'm neither in the fascist nor the communist camp. I'm in the sort of late capitalist, liberal degeneration. Do you know what I mean? Just everything's falling apart camp. But I agree with the image behind you, sort of presenting a return to collectivism there, as well as upper body strength.
Well, yeah, it's kind of, you had these ideologies in the 20th century who were fixated on the idea of perfecting the human form. And obviously, if you're enamored with individualism and pluralism, you consider that to be verboten, no pun intended. But my principle is that you should never skip leg day. So I'm actually more on the sort of thick thighs side of things. So.
Yeah, I don't really know what leg day is. Like, is that a day that you work out the muscles in your legs? I find this whole
because you don't want to be an upside down triangle where you just got these like head shoulders and like weedy asparagus legs.
Like, so is the point that like if you've got like muscular broad shoulders that you're connected to the industrial working class because you, I guess, have like a manual labor job? Is that the point?
Yeah, it's all part of that aesthetic of you probably wing something to operate machinery that you'd use with your upper body.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. Like, I get that, mate.
Oh, I think I've just got a delivery that's come. Go get it.
Oh, good stuff.
The background to this is we were supposed to start recording this earlier, and now Robert's had to go off and get his takeaway. I have to say, you don't get a body like those guys by eating pizza.
And he is getting a pizza as well.
Oh, yeah, that's setting me up for the night. Nicely done. Going back to our sort of fitness, Alan Smith chat. I think the test of a man on the left is whether you can bench press Alan Smith over your head about 100 times. That's why I'm into the whole gym culture thing, gym bro thing. You know. Now, David, if you can do that, then I'll make peace.
I once had an opportunity. This is a great story about Alan Smith. I didn't bench press him, but we were holding an editorial meeting for Conta in a cafe in Glasgow, and George Kerrivan was there, and all we heard from God, do you remember that room? I'm not going to go into that, right? We had a meeting in a crap room that wasn't so much a room as a hallway, right, in this cafe, and so we were sitting there talking this and that, themes and so on. And from over at the counter, I just heard, George. And then into this meeting wanders Alan Smith. Oblivious to the fact that there's a meeting going on, and starts shaking George Kerrivan's hand and so on. And at one point, Alan Smith sort of realised that he was in a room full of people who were trying to conduct some kind of business, regained his composure, and sort of went, right? And it was the eyebrow. You know that eyebrow?
Yeah.
He's always doing that with the speeches, right? And he said, he was like, oh. And I just said to him, yeah, you better not be reporting this subversive meeting back to your EU paymasters, right? And quick as a flash, before he could even really work out if that was human or not, he went, my paymasters are the people of Scotland. Like that. Like, the way he does those speeches, the people of Scotland. And then he started to smile because he kind of realised it was just a joke. He was like a cat, reflexes of a cat. He was prepared to defend himself and the European Union at the drop of a hat. Any moment, if you come at that guy with a criticism of the European Union, he will smite you down with that eyebrow.
Quite romantic though, because I don't think I've ever had a partner like that. You could go to bat for me that quickly. Yeah, it's beautiful.
You leave Robert alone. But I've never bench pressed him, so we'll never know.
So Alan Smith has, so I hear, been in the papers recently, but I haven't followed this story at all, but I know you want to talk about it, so you're going to have to like zeitgeist me as we go. Like, I need a kind of zeitgeist tape once over. So
So last week, a set of emails from Alan Smith, it was kind of a set of internal emails within sort of the Sterling group of the SNP, got leaked. And essentially this was Alan Smith saying that all of the sort of culture war stuff that had been going on, the barring or blocking of Joanna Cherry, and you had James Dornan as well, that was all part of a move towards a form of identity politics that had sort of stunted the SNP's strategy towards independence. That was his view. And of course, he had a huge outcry about this, because the feeling is, well, one of the assumptions was that Alan Smith was part of this general trend, certainly part of this sort of centrist, socially progressive trend within the SNP. But one of the bombshells was that he wanted to cut the number of seats on the SNP's NEC committee, but also he wanted to essentially streamline a lot of the representation of so-called sort of equality groups. And the response to this was that essentially he's become part of the dirtbag left, I suppose. He's now officially part of the anti-woke left. And I just found it fascinating because of the fact that that certain section of the nationalist movement that look on him as sort of the most woke of woke, still scorned him anyway when this leak came out, when he said that, you know, despite being a gay man, I think that obsessions over stuff like GRA and certain ethnic focus on ethnic groups is bad for our strategy and independence, makes us seem obsessed. And I couldn't tell whether this was sort of just a cynical ploy to win back favour with certain sections of the nationalist movement that are fed up with that form of identity politics. But I just think that the dynamics within the SNP when this letter was released was fascinating.
Yeah, so this was my thought. I mean, I'll only say it was leaked. Nothing stays unleaked in the SNP for long these days. But, you know, is it possible that he or his supporters leaked it themselves so that they could say, I'm above all this shit, right? I'm above all the culture war and so on. And at least in theory, he could have both wings covered. He's hard on the neoliberal centrist wing of the party, loves the EU. He's probably the figure in the party most associated with the European Union. Did he feel he needed to reach out to others in the party who are fed up of the, call it what you will, the culture war or whatever? But I think it was also just a really interesting reminder that, like the way you sometimes hear it described is that like there's a really deeply meaningful culture war taking place inside the SNP between a sort of liberal wing and an actually conservative wing, right? These people are all liberals, right? Joanna Cherry, Alan Smith, Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon, etc., 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 etc. These people's politics is all broadly very much the same. They have very similar orientation on society. They are all liberals. That a lot of the culture, this is the thing, people think it's so deeply meaningful. A lot of these culture wars are arguments between different groups of liberals. That's, you know what I mean, whose motivations are partly ideological, but partly relate to ambitions, power, institutions, and so on. So it kind of bursts the bubble a bit, I think, around the mystique around that as a meaningful conflict in the party.
I mean, yeah, I would tend to agree that something like that, which a leak like that in the short term, which will create a Twitter storm, but long term really it is quite beneficial, I think, to Alan Smith, given where things are going in the SNP. But I mean, things that are, I compare this to like things that are leaked out of the Labour Party, which is like WhatsApp conversations of them all calling each other fat bitches and stuff, like, or anti-Semites. Do you know what I mean? This is not a damaging leak in that regard. But this is, I think that it's a dead important point to make. These are all liberals that are arguing amongst themselves and arguing different shades of liberalism. Like, what I don't get about the so-called culture war within the SNP is that you can have someone like Joanna Cherry on the kind of the anti-woke side of the argument, and that's where she is as far as I understand. And you have people like Stuart MacDonald who will come to on the other, and I think they're quite like kind of cartoonish figureheads for this. But Joanna Cherry like actually believes that you can legal your way into change. Do you know what I mean? Like, apart from, it was when you said, David, like that Alan Smith is probably the person most associated with the EU and the party. I think the other person that's most associated with the EU is Joanna Cherry.
Good point. Yeah. He's maybe He's maybe looking to her, thinking she's stealing my EU bit. I'm going to steal her, you know, anti-woke bit. You know what I mean? I mean, these people presumably are looking at each other. They're seeking to replace each other. You know what I mean? I mean, like in some point in the next 2 or 3 years, there's going to be a contest for, perhaps sooner, for a leader of the party. Like, they all have an eye to that general situation, and they'll change their mood on questions like this as the mood changes more generally. But yeah.
I think the responses to all these questions, whether they're cultural or political, really depends on how they want to position themselves on the argument of strategies towards independence. You know, this or the perceived idea of who's got a path that's quickest towards independence. I mean, what's interesting about the email is he constantly frames it as this is getting in the way of independence, or this is distracting us from independence, and it's really about, you know, outflanking each other to project an idea that I'm the person who can actually do something. You know, my politics is the politics of action rather than of institutionalism. You know, I'm more of an action candidate compared to someone like Nicola Sturgeon or Angus Roberts. And it will be interesting to see going forward, like, what more gimmicks these figureheads can do in order to try and convince the movement or the party as a whole about their seriousness in that regard.
Ultimately, it's about the orientation and independence question. This is why I think it might have been leaked by his own side, is that the key line in it was quite aggressive, and I think you wouldn't send that internally, and that the key line in it was when he said, I care a great deal about equalities, but most of all, I care about independence for Scotland, right? And I thought, you've almost delivered that like a conference speech, right? That's the point where people applaud. So, like, yeah, there's quite a strong case to be made that you intended that line in particular to be circulated, which of course it then was by people. This is the thing, that line in particular was very widely circulated around social media, that Alan Smith is ultimately an independence man, right? More than he is anything else. So he got what he wanted if he did indeed do that. But even if he didn't, you know, it's an image of himself that he wants projected. He's always the person at SNP conferences, by the way, to do that, to make the rabble-rousing speech, and he's always makes sure that he's seen as the person who does it. And of course, he also, fought for Stirling to win a Tory marginal to prove other things, that he could win over middle-class Scotland. That was basically the image he was trying to project. So he's clearly setting himself up for leadership. And yeah, all other issues are obviously collateral damage. But beyond that, none of these candidates actually represent a distinctive message on the economy, on independence strategy, on anything like that, as far as I can tell.
I think that's the key point of this, is like, a lot of these differences are actually, I mean, kind of meaningless, because there is a consensus in the SNP on the question of the European Union. For example, like in terms of the 2016 referendum, there was a consensus around that. There's a consensus that the European Union is a force for good in the world, and blah blah blah. When we've actually, this week we've seen those pictures of refugees fleeing Syria. The European Union's response to the refugee crisis is criminal, quite frankly. So there's a unanimous view on, like, the actual ideology, and there's always been a split in the SNP between the kind of the gradualist wing, like Nicola Sturgeon, and the more fundamentalist wing of the party, who want, who are driving that independence agenda. But I think that a lot of that stuff is now being played out in what are essentially bad faith arguments around the culture war. Like, that's what we're seeing, is that they're playing out in those terms. And
the traditional fundies, though, have been defeated. I mean, Sturgeon, Salmons, Cherry, Smith, all these people basically operate under the rubric of the gradualist wing. Like, they've all very much come from the same genetic part of the SNP, which is perhaps why the infight is so utterly furious. Because, it's that famous thing, the narcissism of small differences. When it's difficult for you to differentiate yourself from your political rivals, it gets really nasty, and you start blowing up small differences between you to be more meaningful than they already are. That's a classic process. But this isn't an intelligent way to have conversations about policy, whether it's the GRA or anything. I remember when Cherry got ditched from, she basically did get blocked from standing in Edinburgh Central. And people said, "Oh, let's none of us pretend that this is about anything other than Salmon v Sturgeon and GRA stuff." Sturgeon's already ditched the GRA stuff. Like, she already kicked it into the long grass as soon as she realised it would cause her any internal problems. So that's the level of commitment to any kind of serious political conversation around that issue.
And don't get me wrong, there is a serious political conversation to be had around it, but that's not what the conversation is right now. It's a bad faith argument, all over the place, and it's being used in very tribal terms. I mean, I suppose what a good example of how smashed the fundies got in the SNP is the treatment of Jim Sellers. I have a lot of respect for Jim and a lot of time for Jim. I think that he is a true public intellectual who is not afraid to make arguments in public, even when he has changed his mind. And I think that that's something that ultimately should be respected, even if you disagree with him. But the way that Jim having a clear position on the EU, having his position around the approach to independence, he's been treated as if he is a dodery old guy who's lost his marbles. I mean, it's totally disrespectful.
Yeah, same with Jim Fairley, the former deputy leader of the party, who's very opposed to the European Union, which of course at one time was the standard viewpoint in the SNP. I think that whole generation were written off as dinosaurs and so on. But yeah, so what you've been left is a very strangulated political culture inside the SNP. Which inevitably results in this kind of behaviour. But the most strangulated part, to do a segue, if we're ready for a segue. Segue is to Stuart McDonald's latest comments.
How did you segue? What's the link?
I was going to segue by saying, the most constricted part of the ideological world of the SNP is in fact represented by Stuart McDonald's fascination with the conspiracy in Scottish society in favour of not only Putin's Russia, but also Lukashenko, is that his name?
Yeah.
Who was the leader of Belarus. I didn't know that until about the last week. Oh yeah, he says he didn't know. He says he doesn't know about who drinks
Check
pain
out
is
your
red.
pay slips. Yeah.
Was it Lukashenko? As though I didn't know that, right? So this is the week where, I would say Stuart McDonald finally lost it, but it's been gone for a long time. He said that he tweeted his support for the protests against Lukashenko, who's not. I mean, it's like a tin pot democracy. He's been re-elected after 20-something years, and there's huge protests and so on across the country against this presumably dodgy election. And he tweeted his support for those protests, and then he said, I noticed that the Commonweal types have become strangely mute. Now, the thing is, I think he probably meant me. And the reason I think he meant me was, I don't know who else he could mean. Rob McAlpine, right, who is the director of Commonweal, isn't on social media, right? So it couldn't be him. The other guy
also he has a really healthy love of America, doesn't he?
Robin.
Yeah, he's not an authentic anti-American like you.
No, he's not a Stalinoid. He's just a kind of he's a kind of run-of-the-mill social democrat. But this is what I'm going to go and say. Then there's poor old Craig DL, who is the head of research for Commonweal, who is about the farthest thing from a tanky in the world. But then that's what Commonweal is. Like your average member of Commonweal is a Green, an SNP member, like an independent supporter, a CND veteran, an environmentalist, someone who grows their own organic veg down on their allotment, right? And they're down on their allotment, digging away, getting their various courgettes and carrots and so on. And they have to find out via Twitter that they are now Stalinist supporters of Lukashenko in Belarus, based on an impression of me and my politics.
So the actual tweet reads, incredible events unfolding in Belarus, an uprising on the European continent against an authoritarian Soviet dictator led by women of courage and substance with their fellow citizens at their back. Commonweal types oddly mute.
I love it.
Got absolutely everything there, hasn't it?
It's got everything. Yeah,
I think he really Lukashenko is quite an interesting foil for McDonald, because he's not a Soviet. He's not a Soviet dictator. I mean, he was the last deputy in the Belarusian chamber to vote against the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and he has some sort of vague Soviet nostalgia that he harkens back to whenever there's a military parade. Round about between 1994 and 1998, he was quite critical in making sure that sort of the economic transformation of Belarus didn't descend into what happened in Russia in sort of the early 90s. And that's sort of the limit of anything decent that he did. And then obviously it starts to go downhill from 97 onwards. But he's very useful for someone like McDonald, because he represents absolutely everything, sort of the fantasies of what anything to the left of centre must mean in terms of foreign policy. This kind of hysterical idea that this guy really does represent Soviet power. And of course, this is to do with the liberal imagination. Like, these guys just can't get over the fucking idea that the Soviet Union collapsed. You know what I mean? It's been gone. Just fucking get over it. You won.
Yeah. It's that awful thing of, like, when you lose your worst enemy, that's, you've hit rock bottom, because liberals didn't have something that kind of validated their identity after the Soviet Union had disappeared. So yeah, he identifies them as a Soviet for some reason. He kind of throws a little woke bomb in there with the fact that it's led by women. It is indeed, as far as I know. I think the candidate who was opposing Lukashenko was arrested, and his wife stood for the last several weeks of the campaign. So obviously, do you know what I mean? In the imagination of the liberal, right, what someone who doesn't want to be a member of NATO wants is what is behind you, Robert. Ultra masculine, marching in fucking disciplined order, right? This throwback to like an industrial past where we've all got fucking massive biceps, proletarian biceps, right? Ultra masculine, authoritarian, nasty.
Take it right in my fucking veins.
So yeah, it was all that, and yeah, it's totally bizarre, man. He lives in this bizarre little world. Do you know the thing about Stuart McDonald that I think is a bit sad though, right? Is people always say like it's a conspiracy, like he's been given money and he works for MI5 or whatever it is, right? That's nonsense. But the reason I think that's nonsense is he's cheaper than that. He's easier than that. You can buy him easier than that. Most MPs, when they go down to Westminster, at some point, some lobbyist from Ukraine or Poland or the United States or Israel or whatever will take you into a little side room where there's free canopies and free champagne, and they will say to you, our country is in grave danger of being destroyed by this evil Hitler maniac, and we want you to understand what's going on in our country and to speak up for us in Parliament. Britain and this or that country have these close interests. For some reason, what goes on in my country is of interest to your constituents on XYZ reasons for oil prices or something, right? And most MPs hang around for the freebies, but they kind of understand what's going on here, and they start to slowly edge their way out the door with a polite nod of the head and a smile. And every so often, an MP just gets taken in by the machine and really believes that they are fighting for freedom in about 1957. That they, you know what I mean? It's sort of like, what was it called? Radio Free Europe, but in 2020.
Yeah, I mean the way you describe it, it's like, you remember when everyone got super taken in by that weird campaign, Coney 2012.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that, the way you're describing it, like someone going on the real like hard sell on a timeshare, except that timeshare is like the Ukrainian government's political agenda or whatever it is. I mean, that tweet, I mean, it's so rich in like everything that's wrong with the politics of Stuart McDonald's. I mean, the liberals are obsessed with Russia. They need to have an enemy, and we've seen that in the US, and we see it here as well. I also think that his Red Scare approach to all of this is like, I mean, it's off the shelf Americanism, and I, for one, I'm fed the fuck up of having America dominate our entire political discourse. So not only have they dominated our cultural discourse, they have dominated the speech patterns of Alan Smith with Scotland. Like that transatlantic accent must go. But they now dominate like all political discourse. Like, I mean, you can see that very clearly with identity politics for a start. Do you know what I mean? And like particularly the conversations around things like Black Lives Matter, like where they've taken like a situation in the United States which is bound up in a particular history of slavery, and its fallouts and the subsequent failure of society to address that in any way, and it has been lifted and it has been plonked into Britain, which has a completely different past around empire and colonialism. Like, and I'm not doing is saying like, no, there's no problem here, it's just in America. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is like,
pull down of Cat Boyd now.
Did you just say pull down all forms of statues of Cat Boyd? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, if there is, that's the only reason to get into politics, right? Is to hope that one day someone will build a statue of you, and then in 10 years' time, it will be pulled down by an angry mob. Isn't that everyone's aspiration in life? But yeah, I suppose what I'm saying is like this idea of like the Red Scare, Russiagate, like all of this kind of like American intrusion into political life is honestly, I think, like one of the frontiers that the left in Scotland has to start dealing with. Like, we actually have to start resisting Americanism. And like when I have been reading about like the way that American politics is informing our culture and our discussions, particularly around identity politics, but not limited to that either. Like in the trade union movement, we routinely looked at American organisers who are great at what they do. And we've learned a lot of lessons from them. But again, we are taking like specific things that happen in the United States of America and we plonk them into our situation without any understanding of historical development and historical materialism and how nations are created and how the individual psyches and then the collective psyche within those nations is developed. None of that. What we do is we just go into the big shop called the USA and we take it off the shelf. It's intellectually lazy and it's dangerous because, let's be honest, America is mental.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely have solidarity while also recognizing peculiarities, which is why I've always had some sort of deep respect for sort of French cultural and political discourse in many ways, even you know, with all the sort of hang-ups I have about 1968 and some of the sort of the theorists from France at that period. One thing I can say about both the left and the right, for a very long time, probably until very recently, they had a very strong commitment to an idea of French exceptionalism that wasn't saying that, French culture or French society is any more superior than anyone else, but that our context is our context. And this kind of ingratitude it's termed ingratitude. There's this famous campaign advert that I think the French Communist Party sponsored, where this young French guy goes into a traditional cafe and he's got a bottle of Coca-Cola and he's a salesperson for Coke in between 1945 and 1950, and he gives all the old geezers in there a taste of the Coca-Cola and they spit it out and kick him out the bar. And that's kind of a symbol of the French resistance to American cultural colonialism. And I do feel very strongly about this. People often say, look, you can't use the phrase colonialism. It's insulting to people in the developing world. But I think that's absolutely nonsense. I think that it's not just the economic conquering of nations, it's also the cultural creep, where you no longer have your own references for radical struggle. Like, you think about all the incredible things that have happened that represent workers' power, whether it's in Glasgow or Dundee or Edinburgh, right? Well, not really Edinburgh, but actually I'm going to get cancelled by my Edinburgh friends. Forget I said that, but by all over Scotland, there's this huge heritage of working class struggle, but that's no longer where you get your reference from, because all economic and cultural power come from Washington and New York and LA. And I think it's almost inevitable when you do belong to the Anglosphere. I think language is a huge barrier to that. It's a lot more difficult to dominate a nation culturally if the barrier between English speakers and Russian speakers, or Mandarin speakers or French speakers, language becomes that barrier that you can't necessarily penetrate. And I don't know how we necessarily reverse, other than Cat goes around beating anyone who's got a Netflix subscription. I don't know. What's the solution?
I was muted there. The problem is like I am genuinely fascinated by America, so I do have like a lot of cultural influences in my life. But I think like one of the most obvious examples outside of identity politics to me of like this kind of off-the-shelf American experience just being like adopted, and the kind of intellectual laziness around that is with Boris Johnson. Like, Boris Johnson is not Donald Trump. These are not the same. Because they're both like fat men with bad hair, people think, oh, like they're the same and they're both right-wing. But I mean, like, to me, I'm just like, if you're going to understand them in particular terms, then we can understand them like in populist terms, perhaps. But we can't say that, you've got Trump, well, we've got Johnson, we've got our own version of Trump. And I hear it all the time. Do you know what I mean? And what the right often says that like we have a problem with America because we have a problem with Trump. But that in itself is lazy. It's not just a problem of the left, it's a problem of the right too. That's me fucked my visa chances.
Even if you think about on just one register how different American society is from, for example, British society, the world rankings for religious belief have America up there with like Iran and Pakistan. I think those might be two of the only countries where there's a higher degree of belief in God and church attendance or religious house attendance and so on. People often forget that the United States has a system. The United States is not a secular country. It's a country where the state pays for the church system, right? I mean, it's a funny one that I think, because people hear it all the time, they think it's like laissez-faire, like France's. Like it has this hyper-secularist culture. Nothing of the kind. The American state pours billions and billions and billions of dollars into the church system in America, and on top of that, the religious education system. So the United States actually has a real culture war, in the sense that you have very powerful, really socially conservative elites and genuinely socially liberal elites, who are in sort of places like New York and Los Angeles and so on. In the flyover country in between the kind of the kind of top flight universities, are hundreds and hundreds of Bible seminaries, hundreds and hundreds of theology colleges actually run by the evangelical right. So in America, the socially conservative rich have real institutional power, real bases of power, which are hard to assail and which are supported by the state. That is an enormously different cultural backdrop to what you have in the United Kingdom, where it's overstated, of course, in tabloid newspapers and so on, but liberals do have very substantial institutional power. Places like universities, the BBC, the judiciary, etc., etc. Like that's, of course, that's just one side of it. I mean, you could also look at the police, or the army, or the monarchy. These are institutions where there's a very different state of affairs. But you could never replicate that same cultural battle that exists in the United States somewhere like Britain. It makes no sense whatsoever. And then, of course, there's the issue of slavery being a foundational experience of the United States, and the reality that a huge part of America's working class is a second-class citizenry, and that's an enormous structural part of the country. And again, it's not the same phenomenon here, and there's a constant attempt to import it. The Black Lives Matter stuff made this so clear, right? And it also made so clear what some of the dangers are in this. All of us here, I presume, broadly support that movement and its aims and so forth.
No.
But when it's
you fucking assume shit.
But when it's re-imported into Britain, right? It meant that the strategic focus of the movement was essentially American, but you didn't have an understanding, for example, of like the most violent part of European society towards black people is the Mediterranean Sea, the Europeans' hard border in the Mediterranean Sea, where 60,000 almost exclusively black and brown people have died in the last few years. I didn't see that mentioned once on demonstrations across Europe called Black Lives Matter, right? Because let's be honest, most of the people on those demonstrations have a very uncritical attitude towards the European Union. Now, that is a classic example of where if you don't have an eye to your own national and geographical context, your social movement starts to exist half in a fantasy world that's not relating to the real problems that exist in your society. But sorry, Robert, go on. You were going to tell me you hate Black Lives Matter.
No, I mean, the last few weeks, months has been really torturous because you're in this weird position where you kind of feel like you're only useful if you come out and support a position because it makes other people feel good about themselves. It's the politics of righteousness. It's like, I want to show that I'm in favor of a position because it's the socially liberal position is the dominant position. If I show that I'm in favor of this, everyone will know that I'm a good person, and everyone will know my politics is good, and that equals me being a good and wholesome person. And I just have no time with a politics of gesture and a politics of righteousness. I mean, I really have a deep contempt for a movement and a discourse which has totally obscured the nature of the way class works and the way in which it cuts across racial lines. Okay. Now, it's true that if you are from the black bourgeoisie, if you're black and upper class, you will encounter a certain degree of discrimination. Okay. But it's ignored that can be assuaged if you have money and you have connections. So I'll give you an example. You had the editor of British Vogue, Edward Affinifo. He wrote an open letter and then did a tweet about how he was going to work and they wouldn't let him in the front door of the building because the security guard was like, "You don't work here." I mean, I'm not going to go into the validity of the claim, but that's essentially what he claimed happened. Okay. Now, it was interesting because my dad ran away from Nigeria to escape the civil war there, and I've got an ear for names, and so I thought, this is really interesting. And I looked him up. And in every article, it said, oh, this likely lad from Ladbroke Grove, story of a black working class gay man who rose up, pulled himself up by his bootstraps. And then I researched the family name, and I found out that in one article, we know that his father was a colonel in the Ghanaian army. And then I found out that his entire family were part of a military junta that essentially lost a power struggle. And that's why he ended up in London, okay? And that much of that financing of him coming to London was based off thieving natural resources. That's often how it goes, okay? And so you've got this entire narrative where Black Lives Matter has been used to justify the social climbing of a particular part of the black middle class, be they immigrants or not. And it jars with me because, you know, I obviously work in education and other aspects of my life, and I see people from all ethnic backgrounds in desperate poverty and totally disarmed without any way of garnering collective action. And they must be told that if they don't wholeheartedly support this zeitgeist, that there is something perverse with them. That if you mention that the dynamic of class is the most important thing, then, you know, you are somehow suspect. And so I just can't get behind the whole thing in any form, in any kind of expression. Because for me, it's just like, it has to be class. Because there's so many of these carpetbaggers who just will attach themselves onto the movement. You know, like I remember getting a DM from someone who I know is connected to sort of a BP. Their uncle's a BP executive who works in Nigeria, and they were saying, "Oh, well, do you know any sort of black journalist writers and artists who would like to do this thing where you get like £800 an article?" And I'm like, I know the kind of people who are going to get this opportunity, and it's not going to be people off an estate in South London or wherever. It's going to be people who have connections, but who are able to use their ethnic background as a way of socially climbing. And that's definitely something that's been imported from the US. And I fucking hate it, you know. Like, I'm very conscious of it, like, in terms of myself. Like, you know, my family, most of my family are like working class Windrush Caribbeans. Most of them were, you know, worked as engineers or tube drivers for British Rail, train drivers for British Rail. But I'm not working class. Like, I'm as bourgeois a cunt as you can find, you know. And I don't feel like impressing my particular ethno-narcissistic identity on people as a gimmick to socially climb is at all an acceptable way of conducting politics or being a political actor. That's my rant over.
What do you think in relation? We were going to discuss what you call them. Is it BME lists or whatever?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, again, this is sort of another feature of a party system that's again being culturally colonized from America. I mean, you've got really the attempt to create a sort of, you know, you've got in America, you've got in the Democratic Party, you've got a black congressional caucus, where if you are a Democratic or a Republican senator or representative of the House of Representatives, you can form into a club with other black representatives. And, you know, they say this is due to representation and to make sure you have lawmakers that are a lot more diverse, but what it really is about creating power bases. So you can have a much more honed black political elite. And the prime example of this is Jim Clyburn, who is very much hated by, you know, Bernie supporters, didn't like him a lot because he supposedly swung the primary in favor of Biden. But what they failed to realize is his effectiveness. Like, that's a feature, that's not a bug. The purpose of having BME shortlists is to create a political class, an elite that are essentially loyal to the political machine or to your class. And you can funnel patronage favors through them. And so I think the thing's a terrible idea. I think it's the worst thing that's ever been imported. Again, obscures class. Because, you know, the people who I remember people saying to me, would say to me, "Oh, you should run for something, or you should do this." And of course they would, because they're not going to be able to be saying that to people who are working class regardless of their race. The people who will go for the political office are the middle classes. They are political actors. They wield political power.
Yeah, and this is interesting to me because I think sometimes the left has a very uncritical view in thinking that everything that's gone on in kind of left-wing language, left-wing discourse, left-wing academia in the last 30 or 40 years has been an unsullied path of improvement, where 40 years ago you had grunting trade unionists, with brains like peanuts, who just went around sort of thinking it's about workers versus bosses. Now we have well-rounded leftists who understand, that it's more complicated than that, and that there's there are questions of oppression and so on, as though those are ideas that didn't exist in the old left, right? Which is wrong anyway. But we forget that change, though it may have brought some progress, has also moved in tandem with a general process of retreat for the left and professionalization of left-wing discourse in particular. So that to me is part of what some political scientists call cartelization. So after the 1945 Labour government, you had a Labour Party which could say to working class communities up and down the country, we have delivered tangible stuff for you. We've delivered full employment, we've delivered the NHS, we've delivered the welfare state, etc., etc. Now, I'm not someone who's a fan of Labourism, past or present, right? But that's a real material basis. That's a real material relationship that you can have with the majority class in society. And in the decades since, we've seen a steady erosion and decline of that base of support because the Labour Party has stopped being a reformist party that achieves reforms, right? And in place of that class allegiance, in place of that class base, you have the process of cartelization where centre-left parties become partly communitarian parties, parties for the young, parties for women, parties for various minority communities of all kinds. And this isn't just Bill Clinton said as much. He said you need to build a coalition of these various different constituencies, stitch them all together, and you have a majority of the country, right? You can find a majority of the country without purely basing your politics on the majority labouring population. You might remember a trade unionist got chewed out for pointing this out a couple of years ago. It was, what's his name, Dempsey.
Eddie Dempsey.
Eddie Dempsey said as much. He said that there's a version of left-wing politics that says you bring all these groups together and we have a left-wing majority. The problem with this is, and he was right, but we were told this was Nazism or something. The problem is that the way that social democratic parties build those coalitions is not by opposing oppression or by undermining structural oppression in society or something. They do it by appealing to business elites at the top of each of those community groupings, right? And that, for example, is how the Labour Party has traditionally built its support, for example, in the Pakistani community, both in Britain, both in England and in Scotland. They have gone to a business figure in the community and they build a coalition around him, or they tell him to build a coalition around his influence in the community. Now, that's something quite different from a left-wing politics which has synthesized an understanding of needing to oppose oppression as well as class exploitation. That's a very, very different thing. And it leads to a very cynical and quite brutal politics, ultimately. And I think that's ultimately what... It's interesting to me that people haven't drawn more conclusions from the defeat of Bernie Sanders by that machine. It's true, of course, that people say, well, but those black civil rights legacy networks that exist in the Democratic Party, organised through things like the churches, they don't represent the wider black community. Of course, that's true, but they've never represented that community. Mm. And a lot of these people who say they represent this or that caucus, this or that chunk, this or that community inside these political parties, they're speaking, as you say, for upper middle class or small business interests in those communities.
mean, I find this chat really interesting, having had, very public positions about feminism, and about the feminist movement, which, as a strand of like that kind of identity politics, honestly, I find it a rip-off. It's a total swizz, because what no one ever talks about is the question of agency. No one ever mentions agency and who the agents for change are anymore. And if you talk about class in the context of gender politics in the mainstream, you will be accused of being class reductionist or old left. That's my experience, and what I've discovered is that none of the liberals will argue with the experience, right? Because that's apparently how we conduct politics these days. So when you bring class agency and into the discussion, then you're faced with these accusations. But then in the mainstream, all you are bombarded with is, as a woman, I have no agency. And that's what I'm told, and that's what's reinforced every day by the liberal discourse of the Me Too movement, for example, is that I have no agency in these discussions. I have no agency in contexts with men who are in positions of power and authority, that it's reinforced time and time again that women are victims, and that's all I hear. And it drives me to distraction, because has to be the base for the left, is the rejection of a compulsory victimhood that seems to be out there. And in order to be a virtuous actor in the left liberal political sphere, you have to basically say, yes, I was a victim too. And regardless of who I am, where my life story, which is of zero importance to my politics, I now recognize this, it's taken me a long time to recognize this, is that I reject victimhood because it gives me no agency. So stop telling me that I'm a victim of these things. Yes, I will, I still do call myself a feminist, but and what I want to be clear that I'm not just talking about co-option. I feel like I've made that argument many times, that there is a co-option of feminism, but I think that it's more to do with what's the word I'm looking for? Commodification of feminism. So what has happened is that it's become a currency. So at some point, during the women's liberation movement, it was a dangerous thing to say you were a feminist, right? Because saying you were a feminist meant that you would not in any way get ahead, right? You would never get promoted, you would never get a job, you wouldn't get a fucking boyfriend, right? Now, if I say I'm a feminist, then there's currency there, right?
Yeah.
And what happens is that the language of feminism, or the language of Black liberation, or the language of LGBT liberation, they have become currency because they are built into neoliberalism, and they have become marketized, and they are forms of currency which you can pay if you know the language. So if you have cultural or educational capital in any sense, if you're a member of the professional managerial class, which I would probably put all of us in, given that we all have education to a high level, these kind of things, it's important to know our place within that kind of class strata. But if you know the language and you know how to use it, then you can use it to get ahead. Let's just say that, because that's true. I don't see any I see nodding heads and not this. I mean, yeah. I'm sure there's people listening to this who viciously disagree with this, but it's my experience, guys.
I remember. I mean, I never told David this, but I got a very, very odd offer from the Scotsman, who wanted me to write about the very painful experience of being in the Common Space office and having David reject my offer of jerk chicken and jollof rice, and he wouldn't take it. Too spicy. I felt the burning fire oppression at that moment. And when the Scotsman got in touch with me to write that article, I wavered, but I stayed true, and I said I wasn't going to shoot David. I wasn't going to hang him out there to dry.
Yeah. Just how awful was it?
Could have made a pretty penny from that. Yeah, it's so weird about it. Especially when people know that you've written things and you do come from a certain community, and then again, I'm very skeptical about the idea of a community, because again, that leads on from your point, David, about of the way patronage networks work and not being able to transfer from America to the UK, because people talk about the Black community or the Asian community as if these are cohesive groups that all think the same, have similar histories, have similar sort of founding myths or foundational politics. But I remember getting offers from people, and then it just being very, very silent, because people kind of got the feeling that I wasn't gonna want to progress or fire out writing just because it was part of this whole movement to be a victim. It's like, when you want to be a political actor, nobody wants to know. When you want to have politics simply done to you, then that passivity is celebrated at every corner.
Yeah, I mean, I think that these are probably quite bold things for us to say, but I am glad we're saying them, and I'm not going to edit them out. I mean, certainly it's my experience of I've been asked many times to come and speak at things as a feminist, and sometimes I have said yes, and over the last 2 years I have said no. And that's not, like I said, because I don't identify as a feminist or I don't have feminist views, but because I actually don't think this is useful right now. I don't think this is. I don't think that feeding into a mainstream discourse, which says as long as we have more women in positions of power, then that goes some way to solving the problem. Because I actually don't know if it does. I can't with all kind of my faculties and with integrity intact say that it might, because I just don't think it does. I think it's rearranging the deck chairs. I think it's window dressing for a system which is in crisis. I think it's probably also exacerbating the crisis, and I just want it to stop.
Yeah, there's one point I've always wanted to say, but I've never had a chance to say it, is again sort of referring back to America, but I think it is actually relevant in a tiny way here. When you encourage people to think of themselves as part of an ethno-based struggle, I mean, I had one sort of acquaintance, I can't believe that we're seeing all these sort of white national red pill guys is coming out of all the woodwork. And I'm like, that's interesting. When you encourage people to think along sectarian lines, they act sectarian. That's bizarre. I never would have thought that would have been the outcome of doing that. And the left is really sort of playing around with, through I think cowardice, is playing around with this formula, which assumes that, specifically in the American example, that you're going to have a politics of empowerment and mobilization through ethnic pride, and wishing that nothing's going to happen on the other side. This is politics of guilt, of saying that the only way in which you can have a coalition is essentially if white leftists just act like they're guilty the whole fucking time. It's like walking out of a showing of 12 Years a Slave, and all these white people are just holding open the door for you. It's fucking awkward, man. That actually literally did happen to me. Seriously. It was weird. I've had that feeling for a couple of months. It's that people just held open the door to me. These two women who looked like they were part of a Methodist congregation who just smiled at me. Everyone was smiling at me. It was really weird. Oh
my God, I'm dying of cringe.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah, I hadn't even really thought of that angle of sort of because what we have also seen, in particularly in the United States in the last few months, is because people are always looking to escalate the insights into what racism is. I think this is partly because of the kind of impotency of a lot of this sort of politics. People keep wanting to sort of escalate, make more and more radical our insights into the nature of racism. You've seen, for example, lots of really essentialist arguments appearing. There was that weird, a kind of exhibition of white culture. Do you see this thing? And it was like an organization drew up a graph of things that were white culture and shouldn't be culturally assumed as universal, right? But they were things like working to deadlines, a preponderance for the written word, an emphasis on the nuclear family unit, right? Because these things are all kind of like white Anglo-Saxon Protestant traits, right? But that, like, you can easily end up in this really weird place where, with this kind of discourse, where you say, no, these racial distinctions are deeply meaningful, and it's racist for you to deny it, right? Like, race says a lot about who you are, and if you deny that, you're just one of these people who says they're colorblind or whatever. You know, there are real limits to this concept of race, and traditionally, concepts like class were supposed to expose those limits, not just be yet another identity alongside a different identity. We're supposed to actually be undermining that identitarian basis to some extent.
I mean, I think the problem with that, though, is that class has become an identity as well. Like, class has been like...
Classism.
See, I said this, I'm sure I shared this with you. Anytime someone says classism on Twitter, I mute them. Like, if I follow them, like, I'm not interested in talking about classism. Like, so class has become an identity, and what that's done is, like, it's that kind of... it's allowed people who are in positions of power, who have resources, who have capital, to talk about being working class. To say, oh, well, you see, I'm working class. I'm from a working class background. I grew up in a council estate. I listened to Oasis.
Committing classism right there.
And tea with too much milk and sugar, something like that. I don't know. And what that does is, like, it makes people think that because they are eating an avocado and a cracker, that they're somehow not fucking working class. It's so destructive. And class has become an identity that people can, like, assume and step into, rather than seeing it for what it is, which is, like, the agent of political change, as a, like, relational, like, concept, as a relational force, as, like, this class conflict has, like, determining history. And, like, I mean, we now just instead talk about classism.
I know. And by the way, like, I'm just going to say briefly, do you know when there was that debate about food poverty recently? It seems to turn up on Twitter about every 6 months on a cycle. The number of people I saw talking about their harrowing experiences of childhood food poverty, right, to try and furnish their working class credentials. And you're sitting there looking at it and thinking, aye, right, man. Aye, right. But it's gotten grim when it's gotten to that extent.
Yeah, and why do people think that matters? And why do people think that sharing those personal anecdotes, which, whether they're true or not, I don't really, that's not what I'm investigating here, is like, why do people think that saying, well, I had food poverty too? Why has that become a currency?
The person political, you know. You are your politics, rather than being a political actor that can analyse separate to...
do you know that the personal is political? Do you know what else is political? The political. The political is the political is the fucking slogan that we need the 21st century left. The political is political.
Done. I'm in. Thank you so much, Robert, for joining us, and we'll wrap it up so you could get your takeaway.
Thanks.
Even the thought of it is, like, making me peckish.
Smell it. I can smell the Americanism.
Yeah, because it's a chain, a large high street chain pizza, isn't it?
Yeah, we won't give them any free advertising.
We won't give them any free advertising, because you will get cancelled, because I think they're, like, backed by Christian fundamentalists, because they're in America. That's where, like, all money comes from. It's like God pizza, Jesus pizza, whatever. I'm sorry, God. Okay, so I think my matcha is now kicking in. So I'm going to say goodbye, and thank you again for joining us. And you can subscribe to the pod on contour.co.uk. You can give us money there as well. And yeah, that's us. Yeah?
Yep, see you soon.
See you.
Magic. I'll stop recording.